Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the show. Yet another episode of Crushing Fantasy Football. I am Bryce Lockridge, your host of the show. All right, guys, today's video is going to be awesome. I'm going to be talking to you guys about the analytics that I dive into to essentially come up with my rankings and determine player value. So you can go to all these other YouTube channels that talk about fantasy football, and they'll give you their rankings and everything like that, but they won't really talk to you about the process that they go through to come up with their rankings. Okay, so when I come up with my rankings and you see that my rankings are different than most, now you're going to understand why, because you're going to see that I dive deeper into the analytics than everybody else does, and I'm going to give you every single key piece of analytics that I look at when determining player value. So I am going to dive right into it, and I'm going to be going over every single main position. So I'm going to start right here with the wide receiver position. Now, when it comes to wide receivers, you're going to want to look at target share, air yard share, yards per route run, red zone targets, contested catch rate percentage, targets, receptions, and receiving yards. Okay, so when it comes to target share, this obviously is the amount of targets a wide receiver receives, in relation to his teammates, right? So if he gets 30% of the targets on his team thrown his way, that's his target share percentage. This is hugely important because we know that opportunity is everything in fantasy, and if you have a large target share percentage, you naturally have more overall opportunity share in the offense, more chances to score touchdowns. You're going to have a higher reception count. You're going to have a higher yardage count. It's one of the most important statistics when looking at the wide receiver position. Another very important one is air yard share. Now, air yards are critically important because it's going to determine ultimately what the offense thinks of a certain player. So if a player has a huge air yard percentage in their offense, they're obviously considered very important to the team because they are looking for that player to account for most of their yardage and offensive production. An example, last year's Chris Olave, he had a 40+% air yard share in his offense. This is a very good sign. It's usually a sign of pretty much inevitable, awesome wide receiver production. Next, we're looking at yards per route run. Now, this is critically important as well because it basically means how many yards your offense creates every time you run a route. So if you're a good player and you're making good things happen for your offense, you're going to have good yards per route run efficiency. If you look at players that have good yards per route run efficiency, you almost know that they're inevitably going to receive an increased target share the following season from the season they posted the yards per route run efficiency numbers. Also, red zone targets. This might be hands down the most important one because high-value touches are everything in fantasy. And if a wide receiver is getting targeted heavily in the red zone, it means his team is going to continue to feed him and continue to give him scoring opportunities. And it also means that they trust him in high-leverage situations. So red zone targets are critically important. Contested catch rate is another one. Contested catch rate is something that only the best of the best wide receivers have. If you look at it every season, the wide receivers that have the best contested catch rate are usually guys like Mike Evans, DeAndre Hopkins, right? Guys that are awesome with catching the ball with a hand in their face. It's a sign of talent, and it means they're going to receive more than their fantasy points expected because they're making catches that they're not supposed to make. Also, the more basic ones, targets, receptions, and receiving yards. Obviously, you want receivers that get targeted a lot. You want receivers that get a lot of receptions, and you want a lot of receiving yards. Obviously, I feel like those ones are very basic and very obvious, but they're also critically important. So make sure to look up all these key analytics when projecting wide receiver production for the next season in fantasy. Next, I'm going to go over the running back position. Now, at the running back position, we're going to be looking at opportunity share percentage, carries, red zone touches, routes run, route participation, yards per carry, yards per touch, and yards created per touch. Now, with opportunity share percentage, obviously, you want a running back that ultimately gets 90+% of the carries in their backfield. This is very rare, but the best of the best running backs have it. You definitely want running backs that are workhorses that get at least 85% of the opportunity share in their backfield. Obviously, the overall amount of carries matters. That's a given. Red zone touches is hugely important because that's what creates scoring opportunities. Routes run is a huge one for running backs, okay? So if a running back posts really good wide receiver numbers, they're probably running a lot of routes. But what you can do is you can look at the routes run at the running back position, and even if a running back happened to not put up great receiving numbers in a given season, but he ran a lot of routes, you can reasonably project that the following season he's going to put up some pretty good pass catching numbers, because if they're having a running back run routes, it means they do plan on throwing him the ball. It just, for whatever reason, didn't work out the season before as far as their overall receptions and receiving touchdowns and receiving yards. But if they've been running a lot of routes, it's a good sign that they're going to put up good passing numbers. So this is how you can gain a sneaky edge in fantasy, right? Everyone's looking at the fact that they didn't have very good receiving numbers, and they're just going to take that at face value, but they're not realizing that, hey, they're running a lot of routes, meaning the offense does plan on getting them involved in the passing game. Okay, so make sure to look at the routes run at the running back position. Route participation percentage is huge as well. Yards per carry, yards per touch, and yards created per touch. Obviously, you want running backs that are efficient. You want running backs that, have a good yards per carry efficiency, because that is going to determine future opportunity share percentage. If their yards per touch and yards per carry numbers aren't good, you're usually going to see a drop in overall opportunity share. Plus, it obviously creates more fantasy points when you run for more yards per carry. Also, yards created per touch. This is one of the most important ones at the running back position because, your offensive line is going to create a certain amount of yards that you get automatically. And that's what any running back can get. I can get yards that the offensive line creates for me. But when you bounce off that first tackle and you make that first defender miss, how many yards are you creating all on your own? It's a telltale sign of overall running back talent. The most talented running backs in the league have great yards created per touch percentage. So this is huge for running backs as well. So those are the key analytics for running backs and wide receivers. Next, we're going to talk about tight end. Now, when it comes to the tight end position, you're going to want to look at targets, target share percentage, route participation percentage, routes run, red zone targets, deep targets, receptions, and yards after the catch. Now, obviously, like any pass catcher, you want them to have a ton of targets. You want the target share percentage to be good because it's a telltale sign of how much the offense trusts the player, and it creates their opportunities for scoring fantasy points. Route participation percentage is huge at the tight end position because, not all tight ends run a whole lot of routes. And if you look at Travis Kelce's route participation percentage and every other tight end in fantasy, it's significantly higher because even the best of the best tight ends that aren't Travis Kelce really don't have that good of a route participation compared to elite wide receivers. But Travis Kelce has such a good route participation that it reflects high-end wide receiver route participation. So this just shows the importance of this statistic. Routes run, you obviously want a tight end that runs a lot of routes. Red zone targets are critically important, just like at the wide receiver position, because you want to have scoring opportunities. Deep targets are huge at the tight end position because it differentiates the best of the best tight ends from the just okay tight ends, because a lot of tight ends don't run deep routes. So if you have a tight end that actually runs a lot of deep routes, that's a telltale sign that they're a very good tight end. Guys like Darren Waller and Travis Kelce are tops in the league like every year in this statistic. So you want tight ends that run deep, that receive a lot of deep targets. And then obviously the overall reception count is critically important, and yards after the catch. There are very few tight ends that are elite tight ends at yards after the catch, but guys like Travis Kelce, George Kittle, and Darren Waller, guys that have been the best tight ends in fantasy in the past 5 to 6 years, they all have awesome yards after the catch running abilities. So those are the critically important stats for tight end. Moving on to my next position, and that's going to be my last position here, which is the quarterback position. Now, when it comes to the quarterback position, you want to look at pass attempts, red zone attempts, completion percentage, protection rate percentage, passing yards, passing touchdowns, pace of play, deep ball accuracy rating, carries, rushing yards, and rushing touchdowns. Now, there are more advanced analytics at the quarterback position than there are at any other position in fantasy, and that's because quarterbacks are just involved in so many phases of the game. All right. So, when it comes to pass attempts, you obviously want quarterbacks that are throwing a ton of pass attempts. This creates fantasy points, opportunities. You want red zone attempts because that creates passing touchdown opportunities. You want quarterbacks to have a high completion percentage because that's almost always a telltale sign that they're running an efficient offense. Protection rate percentage is a critically important one too. You want to know that the quarterback has an offensive line that's actually blocking for them and giving them time to throw. Obviously, passing yards are critically important. That's just a given. Passing touchdowns, you got to have receivers, or you got to have quarterbacks to throw a lot of passing touchdowns if they want to be a top 5 quarterback in fantasy. Pace of play is critically important at the quarterback position because, you want an offense that runs at a high pace of play because this creates more plays and more fantasy points opportunities for the team and for the quarterback. Deep ball accuracy rating is critically important. It's a telltale sign of, how good the quarterback is at throwing the deep ball, which is hugely important for fantasy production because it creates the big play passing opportunities for the quarterbacks. And then obviously carries, rushing yards, and rushing touchdowns. You want a guy like Jalen Hurts that carries the ball a lot. The dude carries the ball like 10 times a game right now. got to be a little bit careful with these guys because they do have a high injury risk. But if they do manage to stay healthy for a season, if you look at the quarterback that has like the most carries at the quarterback position, you can almost assure they're going to be a top 3 quarterback in fantasy. And then obviously rushing yards and rushing touchdowns are critically important. But if the quarterback's getting a lot of carries, they're going to have a lot of rushing yards and a lot of rushing touchdowns. So, all right, guys, these are the key analytics that I want you guys to look at. The reason I gave you all this video is because there's so many, fantasy football channels that they talk about their rankings and where they have each player, but they don't really go into the deep dive analytics that you need to look at to understand why these players are projected to do what they're going to do. So make sure to take a look at these deep dive analytics. If you take a deeper dive at the numbers and don't just look at the basic numbers, it's going to give you a huge advantage, and you're going to have a better chance to project player production for the following season accurately. All right, guys, I do appreciate you guys tuning into the video today. I do appreciate you tuning in, and I want you guys to make sure that you use these numbers for your own research so it can give you an advantage. All right, guys, appreciate it. Catch you later.